أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الذي خلقني فهو يهدين والذي هو يطعمني ويسقين وإذا مرضت فهو يشفين والذي يميتني ثم يحيين والذي يطمع أن يغفر لي خطيئتي يوم الدين رب هب لي حكما وألحقني بالصالحين واجعل لي لسان صدق في الآخرين واجعلني من ورثة جنة النعيم واغفر لأبي إنه كان من الضالين ولا تخزني يوم يبعثون يوم لا ينفع مال ولا بنون إلا من أتى الله بقلب سليم صدق الله العلي العظيم. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. He who created me, then he has shown me the way, and he who gives me to eat and gives me to drink, and when I am sick, then he restores me to health, and he who will cause me to die and give me life, and who I hope will forgive me my mistakes on the day of judgment. My Lord, grant me wisdom and join me with the good, and ordain for me a goodly mention among posterity, and make me of the heirs of the garden of bliss, and forgive my father, for surely he is of those who have gone astray, and disgrace me not on the day when they are raised, the day on which property will not avail, nor sons, except him who comes to Allah with a heart free from evil. Muhammad wa Muhammad salawat.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Al-Mahdi, and I'm an orthopedic surgeon in Scotland. It's my great privilege to be here in an institute like Al-Mahdi Institute, and as you can see over here, the pursuit of knowledge is a responsibility upon every Muslim, so says our Prophet. And I think, this is a great opportunity for all of us to gather together and hopefully gain out of the session that we're going to have. I'm here on behalf of Imamia Medics International. I'd like to say a few words first about Imamia Medics International. It was based on the premise of ayat from Quran, whosoever saveth the life of one, it shall be as if he had saved the life of mankind. So in these sort of very violent times, this is so relevant, and I think that Imamia Medics, the founding premise of Imamia Medics encapsulates the need for, if you like, our contribution to make this place a better place to live in. So Imamia Medics is a United Nations accredited non-governmental organization. It was established as an umbrella, or a few professionals from the medical profession came together in 1994 and established this organization. Its sister organization, the IMI UK, was founded here in 1995. So over the years, it's been providing education in the community. One of its latest projects now is the collaboration with the American University of Barbados. And we have amongst us, the appointed dean of the American University of Barbados, Dr. Shabiha Zaidi, about whom I'll be talking a bit more later. It has professional interactions with the likes of with Kufa University. Professor Shabi Haider again has been helping in establishing their curriculum using his experience from Pakistan and from here to provide that expertise. Medical relief activities, as you'll find later on, are again part and parcel of IMI's work across the world. And of course, it's not just for our community. By applying the premise of whoever saveth one life saveth the life of mankind, it's for the greater good of humanity, for the brotherhood of mankind. So you can see over here, Imamia Medics International's activities are pretty much, apart from South America, pretty much everywhere. And hopefully one day, we'd be able to extend our work into South America as well. So it runs a Hajj mission on an annual basis, and they've been quite successful with that. They have activities in Iraq in providing relief, not just sort of relief in terms of medical assistance, but also in providing the logistics and also resources to IMI's various projects. They run an Arba'in camp there, and any medical professionals over here are most welcome to take part in this. I was speaking to a doctor in Iraq only just last week. Knowing that I'm an orthopedic surgeon, he said, why don't you come over and help us set up knee replacements and hip replacements? Yes, I mean, there's a need. At the moment, there are people in Iraq going out to India, being treated in expensive hospitals. And in a sense, you know, any community, especially with the amount of resources available at their disposal, should not have to do that. They should have, you know, they should be self-sufficient. And in a sense, I don't think it is correct on our part as well to sort of make them dependent on any need from us. They should be self-sufficient. And one day, inshallah, we hope that will be the case. So as part of their educational activities and networking, Imamia Medics International had an annual conference, international conference in Najaf last year. And that, as you can see over here, was extremely well attended. So here again is an example of another relief camp. So apart from Iraq, of course, it provides diagnostic services in Pakistan, India, and let's not forget the United States, because remember, we all know that the United States has about 10% of its people who are not covered by medical care. So for the needy in the United States as well, IMI has been extending a helping hand. So I'll take this opportunity to invite Dr. Qasim Jafri, who is the coordinator of Imamia Medics International in Europe, and Dr. Wasi Heather to say a few words, who is the coordinator of Imamia Medics International in the UK. Dr. Qasim Jafri.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. After this beautiful presentation by Ali Mehdi, I don't think so I have any more to add, except that, first of all, I want to convey my sincere thanks to the Institute of allowing us to carry on this activity on behalf of Imamia Medics International. And we have now very distinguished scholars and very distinguished people I can see here who have a thrive for knowledge and try to get as much as possible from this. And after all, we are the followers of Ahlul Bayt, where the baseline starts from the knowledge and to acquire knowledge. Just a few words about Imamia Medics International. As Ali Mehdi has rightly pointed out that it is the organization now almost in every quarter of this world. But our main concentration at present is United States, where the headquarters is and where most of the activities start. Then we have IMI Europe, where two major countries are taking part at the moment, the UK and Ireland. I'm based in Ireland, and I'm by profession a urologist. Then we have Iraq, which is our main activity center also, and obviously Pakistan and Australia and New Zealand. So far, the activities which are happening, as Dr. Shabi Zadi has been appointed recently as the Dean of the Barbados University, American University. That is one of the major work at the moment which is going on. And on the other hand, in Iraq, there are a lot of activities going on at the moment. One of those is the camp on the 40th day of Chelm. This Arba'in camp is every year, which happens in Iraq, and we're able to serve a lot of Zaireen. And through this channel, I would also like to invite any of you who would be interested in coming over and serving Zawar during the time of Arba'in are very welcome to come to get in contact with the headquarters and get an early registration, which probably will be closing around the end of my Mubarak Ramzan. After that, as you know, what's going on in the whole world against the Shias. which Imamia Medics International seriously condemns of all the violent activities, and especially the recent activity which has happened in London. And Shia religion has absolutely nothing to do with this violence, and when we condemn these kind of violence against the humanity, as we say. Regarding the activities in UK, this is the second of its kind, this ethical conference, which has happened here in Birmingham. Prior to that, it was an activity which happened in Edinburgh, and inshallah we are hoping to do another activity in Manchester in a few months' time. I think I've taken a lot of this time, and I think I can speak a lot for a long time, but I think I would just try to cut it short, and like to thank everyone who have come here to join us. And I would now like to invite Wasi Zaidi, who is the IMI coordinator of UK, to have come and speak some words. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is the first time the IMI UK is getting opportunity to talk to you, and Dr. Al-Mahdi has arranged one lecture of Dr. Shabi Zaidi in Edinburgh as well. The IMI is a medical professional organization, and doctors, dentists, paramedics, and pharmacists are the members of the IMI. But we're encouraging the people, non-professional people as well, to come and join the IMI. This is a very important platform, and I think after the Majlis ul Mashia, the Imamia Medics International is the second biggest platform for UK. When I left Pakistan in 1997, and the Sipai Sahaba, they wanted to kill me. Then I realized the information we collected from the whole Pakistan, there are 200 doctors being killed by these people. I think the Sipai Sahaba and Lashkar-e Jangvi, they know the importance of the doctors. What is the vital role of the doctors, and how much potential they have in their personality. They can do a lot for the community. So they start targeting the doctors. When I left, it was 200 doctors. I don't know how much the figure's gone up to now. I think this is the time when the world is changing. Every day the incidents happening, and we entering in a very delicate time, especially for the Shia community. And I strongly advise everybody to come forward and join the community and make it very strong. 2 years ago, we took the step in Hidayat Jafri, London, to establish a Shia professional organization or Shia professional link. To all type of professionals, they have to join and help each other. The current time of the UK, every community, if you see around you, they're all uniting together. And we have to join together as well, because if we don't do that, we will suffer. Definitely we will suffer. In South London, the very big community live inside of us, the Ahmadiyya Firqa. They are so united. And I said to the people, they have the base on false Imam Zamana, but we have believe on true Imam Zamana. That's why the Imamia Medics International chosen Imam Zamana as a chief patron. So we're encouraging people to come forward, not only the doctors, everybody duty to come forward and join hand together. You can see that Mahdi has put this picture. The last conference we had in 2011 in London, and Dr. Qasim Jafri, they gave logo for touching people changes life. And I think this is the message of Wilaya as well, that we had so many conversation about it. So Imamia Medics International is giving very big platform for everybody, not only the doctors, everybody, to come forward, join us, send you details, and we participating in every activities, apart of terrorism, we've seen the other community are doing here. We have very positive attitude for every community. Wherever the disaster happened, we're going there, we're helping, whether it's Pakistan, India, Iran, or Haiti, or America even. So we want, and we're looking in very, with greedy desire to you, to come forward. We want to establish one unit in Birmingham as well, and we have started in Edinburgh. Now we're going to Manchester, Bradford. So any kind of help, the IMI is working in a very broad spectrum. So if you would like to contribute anything with us, we are here. We want that you have to participate in the Quetta, the funds. There are 80 children. They need your help. There's so many families, they have very good life, and suddenly their parents and they died in the bomb blast, and they're working in their houses. The girls working and the cleaning the plates and the houses. It's shame on us. So we have to come forward. We already set up one fund for the Quetta people, and I would strongly advise you people to please come forward. And if you see the website we have, you can go there and you can send your emails. Any kind of a contribution, we will accept that and appreciate. Thank you very much.
So a few important housekeeping rules. Could you please either switch off your mobiles or put them on silent? Now, I've got to tell you that the fire exits are at the back or the front over here. We live in difficult times, and inshallah, this meeting will pass without any problems, we hope, inshallah. On that note, I'd like to invite our panel. So I'd like to invite Dr. Ali Raza Bhojani, who's our first speaker, to come and sort of enlighten us about his perspective on morality and law in Shiaism. Now, Dr. Ali Raza Bhojani, it is our privilege to have him here. I would call him an expert, although he would not agree with that. He calls himself a researcher, but I would call him an expert looking through his biodata, and it's our great privilege to sort of set, if you like, our meeting in motion with Dr. Ali Raza Bhojani.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وأهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين صلوات. It's quite humbling to have this opportunity to address this crowd, especially in the context which has just been set of an organization committed to humanitarian work and making the real lives of people better. Because as a researcher, we're involved with books and theoretical questions. And that's why for us to host this speaker from the Institute's point of view, it's a privilege for the Al-Mahdi Institute to host this, where we can have hopefully a dialogue not only amongst medical professionals, but between people who engage with theoretical questions in terms of understanding Islam and the interpretation of religion, alongside with practitioners who are involved on the sharp end, if you like. So my presentation is titled Ijtihad and the Scope for Ethical Reasoning in Shia Thought, particularly in the context of medical dilemmas. So the idea is to give a picture behind the fatwa. How is the fatwa reached to? Now, it is a technical presentation, but I have the privilege of speaking to a very learned crowd. And so I'm sure that you'll be able to follow us through, and inshallah in the panel, if there's anything left over, we'd be more than happy to engage in trying to clarify anything. So what is meant by an Islamic perspective? The theme of the conference was moral dilemmas in medical context and Islamic perspective. So the initial question is, what do we mean by an Islamic perspective? I mean, normative thinking, when we talk about what we ought to do and what we ought not to do, in Muslim religious thought, is dominated by the fuqaha's reading of Sharia. There are other ways of reading the Muslim sources, but the dominant trend is that of the fuqahas. And within this understanding of Islam, the ahkam of Sharia are the regulations from God which order the lives of humankind in all its aspects, interpersonal and human, divine. This is seen as a comprehensive system of religious duties through which Islamic perspectives are issued. Now, to go into more detail to see how these Islamic perspectives are emerge, we have to distinguish between fiqh and sharia, first and foremost. Sharia versus fiqh. Sharia could be understood as the divine precepts, the ahkam, in the knowledge of God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whereas fiqh is the inference of religious regulation from the sources of Sharia. So we see straight away there's a distance. Okay? Now the process is what scholars refer to as fiqh. And in the context of new issues, often the process is referred to as ijtihad. Okay, the process by which these regulations are extracted from the sources of Sharia. So what we have here, we have a distance between Sharia and fiqh. In reality, there's a third step. We have Sharia and the knowledge of God, then we have the sources of Sharia, and then we have the inference of the fuqaha. Okay? So fiqh ahkam, the regulations which we observe or seek to observe in our life, are the product of ijtihad, this process. Ijtihad, technically speaking, is the exertion of effort in inferring the ahkam from the sources of Sharia, as regulated by a discipline called usul al-fiqh, legal theory. Now, ijtihad is then used for the justification of pre-existing norms. In Shia thought, ijtihad is a dynamic, continual model of inference. Okay, so if we have pre-existing fiqh from our scholarly forefathers, still the contemporary fuqaha need to apply ijtihad to justify those pre-existing norms. So hence we say one of the functions is justification of pre-existing norms. Second is, if you like, ijtihad being a motor for Islamic perspectives on new issues. Now, many of the moral dilemmas you people are facing in your practice, diverse practice, are new issues. There is no two ways about it. So we see ijtihad in producing the Islamic perspectives to address those questions is key. Now, the system in Shia thought offers much scope for informing the moral concerns of medical ethics. So in this presentation, very briefly, I wish to outline the processes of inference employed in ijtihad. So to give you a snapshot of what the mujtahid does. Okay, and then categorize ahkam as primary and secondary. And this overview and this categorization is explicitly with the aim of highlighting the scope and challenges to ethical reasoning in Shia ijtihad with reference to medical moral dilemmas. So the process of inference of ahkam. It's a multi-tier system. So now we're talking from the perspective of the mujtahid. Okay, so this is behind the fatwa. It's a multi-tier system. The first tier is where the mujtahid attempts to find the real hukam in the knowledge of God. Yeah, what is God's regulation for whichever issue we're examining? If for some reason the mujtahid fails in his attempt to find the real hukam in the knowledge of God, he refers to a second tier of evidences. These evidences are practical principles which allow the mujtahid to offer a practical stance in response to that question. And we'll look at each of these tiers in more detail. Then we could talk about another tier in the system where you can have the possible circumscription of these ahkams, modification of these ahkam from either of the above two categories due to some extraneous circumstances. So we could look at a question in isolation and search for its primary hukam. We may fail to find its primary hukam, so the mujtahid offers a practical stance. Then in context, we may need further considerations to curtail the scope of either of those ahkam. And we'll look at each of these in turn. So the first tier, what are the reality-securing evidences? Quran. Sunnah. Obviously in Imamia thought Sunnah is the actions, the words, the tacit approvals of Rasulullah and the impeccable Imams of his progeny. Al-Ijma. Now this is normally listed by the Shia Usulis as a first tier source, but it's not considered an independent source in Shia fiqh. It's a means to Sunnah. Al-Aqal, rationality. Okay, and very, very important in the context which we're discussing. So Quran and Sunnah on new issues. Like I said, I'm just giving a snapshot for an insight to the discussion, inshallah, going forward. How does the mujtahid approach the Quran and Sunnah to deal with new issues? Whether it's stem cell research or euthanasia. Euthanasia, maybe you could argue, is not a new issue. Maybe we could find precedent. Stem cell research, everybody would agree it's a new issue. We're not going to find it in the Sunnah. So how do we approach the Quran and Sunnah to engage with these issues? First of all, these textual evidences are read based on the apparent meaning of the texts using linguistic principles. So this is to do with a methodology with which the mujtahid reads the texts. In terms of a new issue, does the text directly deal with the issue which is at hand? So can we find an instance of a companion of the Prophet or the Imams asking the Imams, can I stop treating this patient? For example, that would be something relevant to the question of euthanasia. Okay, so we could say, have we got anything of this nature in the texts? If we said no, and it doesn't fall within the scope, if we say no, there's nothing which directly addresses the question, the mujtahid would take another turn, and he would say, okay, is there some general principle in the text which this new issue can be subsumed under? Okay, so is there something about suicide in the texts and pushing yourself towards tuhlaka? Okay, and does euthanasia, or issues relating to euthanasia, can it be subsumed under this or not? For example, egg and embryo implantation. If it was assessed, if the questions surrounding egg and embryo implantation were assessed through the verses on the obligation to chastity and marriage as being the boundary of sexual relations, it gives a very, very conservative picture of the questions. Okay? And there's this tendency that this approach of subsuming new issues within general edicts from the Quran and Sunnah is leading to conservatism in Shia fiqh. So that's Quran and Sunnah on new issues. Very, very briefly, a snapshot. Okay? Al-Aqal. We've left ijma because we said it's not a substantive, independent source. Okay? Now, rationality is considered an independent source of fiqh and Shia thought. Now, this is something to a great extent which is unique in our scholarly heritage, and something which we should be very, very proud of, and something which is dynamic, okay, and something which holds much potential for resolving many of the issues that we have. This place for rationality as a primary source alongside the Quran and alongside the Sunnah stems from a Shia moral rationalism. Okay, as it stems from our usul ad-din. Okay, so from our concept of adl, we call ourselves adliya, the people of justice. Okay, and the premise of this belief in God's justice stems from a meta-ethical premise that humans can understand that which is morally good and that which is morally bad, independent of revelation. Now, this offers a rational moral framework to Sharia, okay, and opens the door for rational principles to drive responses to bioethics. So when we come across concepts like autonomy, and we come across the necessity for consent, and these purely rational moral principles being so influential in bioethics, they have a firm foothold, okay, at the center of Shia theological and jurisprudential thought. So the first here, reality securing evidence. We said Quran and Sunnah don't, on the whole, directly address new issues. Actually, they don't address new issues, because then it's not new. If we can subsume it within a pre-existing general, it's not a new issue. So if there's genuinely a new issue, the Quran and Sunnah doesn't directly address it. Okay, ijma is not an independent source in Shia fiqh. Al-Aqal, however, on the other hand, has huge potential influence as an independent source. Although currently, its role is largely limited to the rational interpretation of texts for the majority of fuqaha, despite these fundamental theological resources. Now, if we can't find a solution from these primary sources, we said we move to a second tier of evidence. These are practical principles. I'm not going to go into detail of these, but some examples. We have a principle called the principle of exemption or liberty, which I will discuss a little further because it has massive implications in medical ethics. We have a principle of continuity of previous certainty. I'm in doubt whether my wudu has broken. Okay, I was definitely in a state of wudu. Am I now in a state of wudu? The Imam, Sadiq Salamullahi alayhi, has said to his companion that doubt cannot obliterate certainty. So I don't know whether I'm in wudu or not, but according to this principle, I should rely on my previous certainty. Okay, so this is an example of istishab, principle of caution. Now these are non-reality securing evidences. They're not finding the real hukm in the knowledge of God. Okay, they are a shari mechanism to give practical solutions when we can't achieve the real hukam in the knowledge of God. So for example, of my state of wudu, I might or might not actually be in wudu. I'm in a state of doubt. The practical solution would say ignore your doubt, okay? And it's good for the Sharia. Yeah, so it's a practical stance, not a means of getting the real hukam, okay? So it's a means to a practical standpoint when the real hukam is unknown. Right, now the principle of exemption and liberty is very, very important in the context of the problems I'm sure many of you have faced and continue to face. Now this, in the modern framework of Shia Usul al-Fiqh, is considered the primary of these practical principles. There's different mechanisms of how it becomes the primary, but there's unanimity that it is the primary principle. There's also some dispute as whether this is a substantive source in itself or a practical stance, as I've just outlined. Irrespective of these theoretical debates, it has huge implications with reference to the questions of medical ethics. So what's the content of this principle? The content can be framed in the manner of stating that everything that is not positively forbidden in the Quran and Sunnah, and for which there is no rational grounds for its prohibition. Remember we said rationality is an independent source of shar. So here there's a qualification here. We have no rational evidence also for its prohibition. Then it is lawful and permissible. Okay? So in the absence of evidence, there's the presumption of liberty and permissibility. Now this is a source of huge liberalism in Shia medical ethics. All right, so in terms of stem cell research and these things, we say Iran was just letting it go in the early days. All right, a lot of the reasoning behind it stems from this principle of exemption and liberty. Justifications, the importance of it in your context, I think deserves me to discuss some of the justifications for the principle as well. First and foremost, this is a basic rational principle because it's immoral to punish someone for something they were not informed of. The Quran doesn't say anything about it, the Sunnah doesn't say anything about it, we don't have any rational means of prohibiting it. So if it was prohibited, how could God hold us accountable? It would be immoral, but we believe in a just God. Okay, so it has a rational basis to this principle of liberty. Quran, there's numerous verses of the Quran which can be used to support this principle. For example, 17:15, مَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. Nor do we punish until we have sent a messenger. So until we have been informed, there's the absence of responsibility. Hadith of Imam Sadiq, salamullahi alayhi. And you see this formulated very closely to the content as is being used by the fuqaha. Everything is permissible for you unless you know that it's specifically prohibited. بِعَيْنِهِ in one version of the hadith. So applying the principle of exemption and liberty. So if we consider egg and embryo implantation are examples of novel issues, if we accept that. And if we said that yes, they are not dealt with directly or through a general principle in the Quran and Sunnah. I'm giving you a hypothetical situation. I'm not saying that this is the case. We may find a mujtahid who believes, no, they have been dealt with. Okay, but if we believe they are new, if we find they have not been directly addressed, there's no general principle in the Quran and Sunnah, and we have no independent rational argument against it, it falls under the scope of exemption, and hence in itself, it is permissible. But there's no categorical norms in fiqh. The application needs to take into account broader considerations and consequences. So it couldn't be associated with any prohibited act, either as a prerequisite or as a result. So if it required illicit relations in advance of the implantation, it would be prohibited. If it leads to the breakdown of social coherence because of the loss of genealogy, it may then again be considered prohibited. So the permissibility of using this principle of liberty has to be qualified by broader considerations, many of which tend to be situational and contextual. The fiqh system is one of conflicting duties. Right? Fiqh system acknowledges that there are multiple norms which may be applicable at any one given time. And the action guiding principles which result should be on consideration of these multiple duties, with reconciliation usually done by the mujtahid in favor of the strongest or the rationally most important. we often just see the fatwa, you know? Okay, so the process of inference of ahkam, we talked about it being a multi-tier system. We said first tier system is the attempt to find the real hukam, Quran, Sunnah, Aql. So if we can't, we refer to secondary principles. The primary one being principle of exemption. Look, there's a detailed discussions of when are they applicable, when are they not applicable. I haven't gone into those at this stage, but it's to give you an insight, a snapshot. Then we said that there's the possibility of circumscription of these ahkam, wherever they come from, first tier or second tier, depending upon extraneous circumstances. And for me to add to that, we go to this distinction of two categories of ahkam. So these regulations from which we are attributing to God are of two categories, primary and secondary. Now the primary hukam, al-hukm al-awwali, is the regulation, if you like, when all things are equal. It's a very abstract notion, actually. Okay, in a neutral state. Those who live in the world, we know there's no neutral states, actually. Okay, but it's a very important concept. Okay, I don't want to belittle it. This is the aspiration. We want to find the primary hukam when all things are equal. So, for example, water is permissible for me to drink. There's a regulation attached to this. I may drink it. I don't have to drink it. It's not disliked for me to drink it. It's permissible for me to drink it. Acting to preserve human life is an obligation. This is the primary hukam. Wujub hifz an-nafs. Okay? It's the primary state. When all things are equal, all right, there's an obligation to preserve human life. What is the secondary hukam? The secondary hukam is the regulation when all things are not equal, when there's some situation of constraint. So if I was to be dying of thirst, then the hukam attached to this water would be one of wujub. It would be obligatory for me to drink this water. Okay, so that's considering the circumstances. Now, of course, we may ask the obvious question in this context, that when is there a situation where acting to preserve human life is not obligatory? Is there such a situation? Okay? As I said before, there is no categorical norms in fiqh. My father, who's a GP, has said to me many, many a time, never say never in medicine. And you know what? After having the opportunity of studied fiqh and usul al-fiqh and the mechanism of ijtihad, I think we say never in fiqh. Possibly the only exception to this, again based on our adliya background, is that justice is never bad and oppression is never good. Okay, so to help us regulate these secondary ahkam and this contextuality of fiqh in its process of derivation, the fuqaha have developed certain maxims which assist them. These qawaid al-fiqhiyah. Now amongst them there are maxims which help regulate the inference of secondary ahkam, these contextual situations if you like. And these have again extensive application in the case of medical ethics. So very, very quickly, we'll just highlight those, again as a basis for our subsequent discussion inshallah. Now the maxim of non-hardship is arguably the most important of these principles. There are other of these fiqh principles which have broad implication, including issues such as medical liability and indemnity and all these types of things, like the qa'idat al-yad. But let's just look at this qa'idah, la haraj, very, very briefly. The maximum of no hardship, la haraj. Now this relies on evidence from Quran and Sunnah which negates the legal imposition of hardship when it comes to religious responsibility. Rephrasing that, a religious responsibility cannot impose unbearable hardship. If it imposes unbearable hardship, it's no longer a religious responsibility. Okay? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, it says, مَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُم مِّن دِينِ بِالْحَرَجِ. Okay? Again, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ لَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. And Rasulullah himself is reported to have said, I've been sent with the pure, easy mission. Okay, so this notion of ease is central to the fiqh discourse. It is, however, a complex principle. Hardship can be personal, hardship can be social, hardship can be global. Okay, and there's debates about the notion, basis, scope, criteria and application of this principle. For example, there's broad consensus that haraj, unbearable difficulty, can remove obligation, but can't necessarily remove prohibition. All right, so there are complex fiqh debates behind this. But just looking at the potential scope in an example of medical ethics before I conclude. So if we look at la haraj in medical ethics and we consider passive euthanasia, so the removal of medical treatment or the cessation of medical treatment, we've already stated that there's a primary obligation to preserve life. And we said this is a very, very important obligation, especially with the humanitarian ethic of Islam, which has been demonstrated in some of the earlier comments. But what if preservation of life imposes unbearable hardship for the person, for the family, for society at large? Okay, now such reasoning, okay, does this lift the primary obligation? Now such reasoning does impact fuqaha. Okay, and you, I am sure, know better than me that it impacts medical practitioners on the ground. Simply allowing a terminal patient with consent to return home to die with his family. Now we see scope for ethical reasoning in Shia thought. But the questions of bioethics are complex and situational. So hardship is never constant. Okay, it can be social. The pressure may be coming from society. The pressure may be coming from politics. The pressure may be coming from the family. The pressure may be coming from beds. This is complex and situational. Now, Islamic, to reflect, this is just in the case of hardship, but this is across the board in bioethics. Now, Islamic perspectives, you see me putting them in inverted commas, and we had that differentiation in the first place between fiqh and sharia, and the complexity in the process of fiqh. So Islamic perspectives, is qualified, okay? This is something we're trying to achieve, that knowledge of God. And they cannot be produced, Islamic perspectives from the fuqaha cannot be produced in a vacuum from expert knowledge. Okay, we need medical insight. Where is the point of brainstem death? This is not the realm of the fuqaha, for example. Socio-political input. Okay, in terms of resources, just use of resources. These are moral questions. There are not unlimited resources, whether it's a rich economy or a poor economy. There are purely moral questions and philosophical questions. Okay, what is life? What are we trying to preserve? Quality of life or life in itself? All right, so these are purely philosophical questions. And so you see the faqih is only part of the solution. Now bioethics, disciplines like bioethics is pushing fiqh discourse. But there is great scope in a dynamic and evolving system of ijtihad in Shia thought to respond. Okay, and some of the things I've highlighted is rational morality being an independent first tier source of evidence. So rational moral considerations are a primary source potentially. The principle of liberty is a primary second tier evidence, and we've seen its possible implications. The use of maxims, we've given the example of la haraj, maintain the complex and situational nature of ethics. But this scope demands increasing collaboration with non-fiqh experts in reaching Islamic perspectives. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.
Very good. Excellent.
Thank you very much, Brother Ali Raza, for such an eloquent presentation and putting, if you like, the whole framework to the meeting, where he touched upon, if you like, certain issues. But, just think about it yourself. We could find ourselves in that situation, both as individuals, either with ourselves or with people in our family, or as medical professionals, facing all these dilemmas. And I mean, the dilemmas really are life and death issues, right from the beginning of life, where if you have somebody near to you who's not able to conceive and it's found that their partner is actually sterile, what do you do then? What exactly do you do when a loved one is needing a transplant, and the only way of getting a transplant is a cadaveric transplant, or you for yourself, who would probably find it very uncomfortable to actually donate your own heart, are looking for a donor to transplant your own heart? What do you do in that sort of situation? As a doctor, what do you do when you find that all medical treatment has ceased to work? Do you actually sign that DNR form? Would you be willing for a family member to have their chest thumped, for those who don't know, CPR, which is cardiopulmonary resuscitation, involves a fairly traumatic process. When do you switch the ventilator off? So to put context to that very eloquent speech from Dr. Ali Raza Bhojani, I'm going to invite Dr. Shabih Haider Zaidi to talk about the specific medical, ethical, moral dilemmas, and he'll be quoting examples of how these have been addressed in different parts from a Shia perspective. So I'd like to introduce Professor Shabih Haider Zaidi, who is an ENT surgeon, recently retired from practice in the UK, but previously he had been a professor and a dean of Dow Medical and Sindh Medical Colleges in Karachi. And more recently, he has been appointed as dean to a collaborative project of Imamia Medics International, which we've referred to earlier, the American University of Barbados. Now, I'm not going to make a plug directly for the American University of Barbados, but all I can say is that from what I've heard and what I've seen online, it's a very promising project. And what's the beauty of the project is that it, for a very economical cost, as we all know, medical education is very expensive. Thank God it's funded by the state in this country, but in countries like America, India, by and large, medical education is funded privately, and it's prohibitive, especially for people who belong to a middle-class background. It simply can't, it's not affordable. So Dr. Shabih Haider told me that the cost, the annual cost of medical education in the American University of Barbados is actually is reasonably affordable in dollars. You can speak to him later on about it. So on that note, I'd like to invite Professor Shabih Haider Zaidi to give his lecture.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you so much, Al-Mahdi, and I feel very humbled in front of this august gathering and audience of very learned scholars, and we've just heard the celestial talk, which has really enlightened me profusely. I mean, it was a beautiful talk, and I'm certainly going to benefit in the future when I write about certain matters. Fiqh and ethics go together, and there is an interface where we have to join together. I was going to talk only briefly about a very particular topic that I had in my mind, but Al-Mahdi told me that in Edinburgh we had a very successful meeting, and there were lots of students who wanted to learn about ethics per se. What is ethics, and how has it evolved over the years? So I've just expanded a few slides, but my basic talk will be different. Qasim will kindly help. I'm going to talk about social anthropology and its impact on medical ethics. And in that context, I'll particularly talk about role of culture. And there is a philosophy, next please. There is a principle that goes on in the circles of philosophers and ethicists throughout the world these days, whether ethics should be universal or there is a concept of, or there is a place for moral relativism. And I'll briefly talk about it later when we go on to the next. Now, ethics, as we know, is a very standard terminology from the standard books. That is a word derived from ethos, a Greek word which basically means code of conduct, a practice of certain principles that influence life as well as death. Next, please. Medical ethics is a branch of ethics, which in turn is a branch of philosophy. In fact, philosophy is a mother with 4 or 5 branches. It has branches like ethics, logic, aesthetics, metaphysics, and I would like to add theology to it, though there is some controversy about that. Normative ethics deals with the theories and the principles. Applied ethics, what concerns us most, is the application of medical ethics and the philosophy of ethical principles in biosciences. Next, please. The Islamic principles, as I have learned over the years, readings and things, is that there are 4 principles of medical ethics in Islam: al-takrim, al-bir, al-adl, wal-ihsan. Next, please. Now, Islamic ethics started a long time ago, but recently in 1992, these philosophers in America have put the whole thing into context of our culture as we work in the Western societies. We have to, because we practice here, so we have to know the terminology. And they have identified these 4 principles. I'll briefly talk about them. Autonomy, which is basically al-takrim; beneficence, al-bir; non-beneficence, that will correlate to beneficence, and justice, which is the prime factor. And I think justice is the brick, the founding brick of medical ethics. Next, please. Now, morality, as Dr. Bojani said, does not mean that you should follow revelation. People have been moral before the religious thoughts came up. And can you go back? Yeah. Long time ago, Hammurabi gave us a code of conduct. This is the first recorded code of conduct. And recently, when I was in Kufa and then went to Babylon, they kindly invited me over for a lecture. So I requested them to take me to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and the famous Nebuchadnezzar's castle, the old fort. And they took me there. And I was helped there by a gentleman, Dr. Hassan, who's an anthropologist and also an epidemiologist. He told me that this code is available because they use a special clay which was mixed with lead. And still there somewhere, he thought probably Topkapi Museum in Turkey. I'm not fully sure of that. But this was the first code of conduct. You can see the year there. Hippocratic is the oath that we normally take throughout the world. And then came the World Medical Council's Helsinki Declaration, which actually came after the Second World War, when there was a Nazi experimentation, all that started. And it's updated almost every few years. The last one is 2008. And I think 2010 has just been published, but I haven't accessed it so far. I don't know much about it. Then there is a Muslim physician's oath, which was proclaimed in 1980s after the OIC's meeting in Kuwait. And this is the oath which is being taken in Muslim countries. Lots of philosophers have contributed towards ethics much before Islam and Christianity. There were sophists. Sophists like Thales and Pythagoras, which of course all of us know. Sophists were people who used to charge a certain fee for education. They were not really liked much, but that was their profession. Then came the Greek greats like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Of course, Aristotle is the one that we are deeply influenced with. Then came the Byzantine Christians, Jesuit priests, and the Coptic monks. They all contributed towards morality and ethical principles in their own ways. Next, please. Socrates, of course, is the father of philosophy, you might say. And he said that goodness is the greatest human attitude. Plato defined knowledge, and this is a beautiful definition. I've written a chapter on it, that knowledge is virtue. If you have knowledge, you can differentiate between good and the evil and so forth. Aristotle introduced the first theory of ethics, which is called virtue theory. And his book called Nicomachean Ethics is still available, and I would strongly urge anybody who's interested in ethics to read it. It's available on iPads and everything. And it's worth reading that after so many thousands of years, still it's applicable. Islamic sources, as Brother Bojani was saying earlier on, Quran, Sunnah Muhammad, Sirat Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, Aqlu Idrak, and Ijtihad. And he gave a wonderful expose on Ijtihad, which I'm certainly going to request him to give me a copy of, which I can use for later discussions in future. Of course, we know that Noble Quran is the final divine testament in ethics. Hadith and Nabi, which is written here, that I'm sent, the Prophet said that I'm sent to teach ethics. Imam Ali alayhi salam was a perfect model. So there was a concept of what's called normative ethics that Prophet gave, and applied ethics in the form of a model that the Prophet gave in the form of Ali alayhi salam. So he had the role model sitting there. Nahj al-Balagha is a roadmap on ethics. Anything that you want to learn, you can go to Nahj al-Balagha and find the answers. Next, please. This is wonderful. Amr bil Ma'ruf. Quran is, there's so many ayat or references in Quran, but I've taken this from Imam Hussain alayhi salam. The mission statement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam in Karbala was Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar. And this, I think, is the fundamental principle of Islamic ethics, whether medical or otherwise, moral philosophy. Then Imam Sayyid al-Sajjad al-Salam, they gave us the Sahifa Kamla, and in the last ethics newsletter, which I edit for IMI, I published this, Dua Makarim al-Akhlaq, and the lessons for a physician that you can obtain from it. That's amazing. You should read it as a physician, and you'll find these things. And discourses of Imam Baqir alayhi salam are available. He had several thousand students, and with reliable authority and authenticity, I'm telling you, that I learned from a very learned scholar, that the zero, sifr, was introduced by Imam Baqir alayhi salam to the Muslim world. Zero, sifr, was already available to the Hindu mathematicians. And one of his students, when a Hindu Brahmin, who gave him as a gift. Before that used to be what, from the times of Ptolemaic right up to Imam Baqir alayhi salam, the digits were between 1 and 9, and they used to struggle with the 10th figure. Imam then gave a lecture, and he said that I'll give as a gift to the mankind, Imam Baqir alayhi salam. And Imam said, next please. Farzand Rasul, Imam Jafar al-Sadiq alayhi salam, whose niyaz we are celebrating these days, he had a university in Medina, which, where he taught for 36 years. And according to some reliable sources, he produced 40,000 students. He used to have Jesuits and priests and all kinds of people. He was a mathematician, astrologist, and a teacher. Next, please. Now, there is a very bad concept, a misconcept, I would say, about the world, or the Western world, that Islam did not contribute to any particular thing, philosophy in particular. The thought that after the decline of the Greek race, after the decline of the Byzantines, there was a gap until the time of Renaissance Enlightenment, which is wrong, because Islam, from the times of Prophet, which is 610, up till about 1200, in fact, even later, lots of these people, they're all philosophers of immense depth. They came to the world, and they helped the world in producing and giving a lot of knowledge and distributing throughout the world. Next, please. Jama al-Azhar, not many people may know that it was basically Jama al-Zahra. It was established by Fatimi dynasty, Al-Hakam. It was a Shia fiqhi masjid, basically. And then Salahuddin Kurd, when he came to destroy the Fatimis, he converted into Jama al-Azhar. Even today, if you go around that mosque, there is a Hussainiya and Zainabiyya, and people from the original Sadat still live there, in that particular area. Ibn Rushd, very controversial philosopher, but he introduced Aristotle to the West, because whatever was translated in the times of Mamun Rashid and all these people, Mamun Rashid did a very clever thing. He hired intelligent people and said, translate Aristotle. Why? Because these creative people, if they started thinking, they'll ask the question, why is this man doing Sultani? But he doesn't. So he said, all right, hire them all, put them in the libraries, let them translate. The other thing was that these Abbasi caliphs, like Aristotle, because Aristotle was basically, he said that the people who should rule, they should be the people from the aristocracy. And he believed in slavery, so it served their purpose. So it is justified by hiring Aristotle's thought to justify their kingdom and their sultani. So it was very, but anyway, he did some contribution. Now, briefly about ethical theories in the medical context that we use. Deontology is the world-famous theory. It was given by Kant, Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher. It focuses on duties and obligations. It means that you should do an act with the purpose of achieving goodness. And this is a word to remember. The means as well as the ends should both be good. As compared with this, the next theory. This is a very famous theory called utilitarianism, and I think this maslaha concept comes from here. And it was given by Bentham and Mills. It says that the consequences of an action, the results of an action, what you achieve, may justify the act. So what it means is for a broader benefit, you might bring certain harm to certain people. This is a theory that Nazis use for human experimentation. They said, because the world will benefit with all these experiments, let us get rid of certain Jews and gypsies and things. And still being used in certain areas for human experimentation in the world, particularly in the third world, and here and everywhere for animal experimentation. They said you kill animals so that you can save the mankind. So that is basically the concept. The virtue theory is the original one that was given by Aristotle, and a wonderful philosopher, which is worth a read, McIntyre, has revived it, neo-virtue theory. Now, what does it mean? I think I've got a slide there. Next, please. It basically means that the quality is built into your system to be virtuous. I mean, some people are born virtuous. They don't have to portray, but they have to show. It's just not the belief in their virtuous character, they are virtuous, but also to show it to the world that they are virtuous. And I think we have good examples of the pious Imams. They were virtuous inside and they're virtuous outside also. There are people who pretend to be virtuous outside, but inside they're not. This is a very popular theory these days. Next, please. Now I'll go on to my topic and briefly talk about various things. Now, culture is a part of social anthropology. It is defined in different ways, but this is the one that I've taken from a famous scholar called Hassan Shana. It is defined as a way of life comprising of certain values, norms, practices, habits, and habitats. Okay? How does culture impact medical ethics? I'll briefly talk about it. It is variable. The culture is different between races and different regions. For example, my ancestors, who were probably Arabs, that's what I'm told, because I come from Sayyid As-Sajjad, Islam. When they went to India or Iran, they used to wear the abaya and the abba. But when they went to India, because the climate or whatever reasons, and I think partly because a clever man called Akbar, he submerged all kinds of races and everything into it. He started and he developed a new culture and gave different concepts. For example, there were Muslims and Hindus and Arabs and Afghans and Indian and Sakas and Dravidians, and he merged them all together and said, all right, let's form a new. And that is, I think, what has affected our culture in many ways. The fundamental principle of religion, namaz, salat, throughout the world is the same. But what we wear to say that do our ibadat, namaz, that is a cultural thing. So religion is like your body or soul, and that attire that you're wearing is culture, and that varies from place to place. Just briefly, impact of culture on our races who came from Iran, for example, or from Arabs. Jodhpuri collar was popular amongst the Hindu Brahmins. Abba was very lovely flare and everything. So Akbar's court, who were all basically psycho friends, they said, let's design a new dress. They took the collar from here and Abba from the lower thing and developed into Sherwani. Then, yeah, this is true. It's anthropology. Then they had people who used to eat meat, and there were people who used to eat dal. Somebody would say, I prefer the rice. They said, well, put it all together and do the ghota, and it will become a halim. But the best thing is about tabla. Tabla jung came from Afghanistan, and it's still popular there. It was very loud and rowdy, and these musicians like Tansen and other people, they didn't like it. I think it was before Tansen. They divided into two, the right tabla and the left is called tabla. That's how it's, and anthropology develops over the period of time, centuries, and all that is affected. For example, Qawwali is basically a Muslim version of bhajan. It is not seen in the Arab world, right? Mehndi, henna is popular, for example, in India and Pakistan, it's not so popular in some other countries, and like most, and different things. So anthropology covers everything, the way you live. And culture, I would just talk about one thing, and taking this cue from Dr. Bojani about the importance of consent, because consent is the spine of medical ethics. Informed consent in the West is totally different. What we practice here as doctors is totally different to what is practiced in the West, and I have worked in both places, I know the difference. Here, the consent must be given by the patient himself. And if it's a minor, it should be the mother. Right. Totally different situation. I'll give a scenario several times that happened to me in Pakistan. I was practiced there. A patient walked in. His diagnosis was cancer of the larynx. I knew that because I had everything. Before I would talk to him, the son came in. He said, Baba se na kahiyega. Please don't tell him. His son said, we'll talk separately. So I went to the other room. He said, if you told him that he's got cancer, he'll die today. I said, look, if I have to go for a procedure like endoscopy or laryngectomy or something else, I have to have his consent. He said, hum de denge, we'll do it. Very common. Is it ethical or legal or not? That is called, this is a new concept that I don't think I have seen it before, but probably, but we've used it on several occasions. This is called a surrogate consent. And the worst form of surrogate consent, I'll talk in a moment about it. Next, please. Now, before I go into that, there are certain moral principles which are universal. So relativism applies to culture and certain things. But there are certain things which are not culture sensitive. Respect for adults, for example. I'll give you a very simple example. When the patient walks in here, we say, please, thank you, etc., etc. In Pakistan and India, once you say tashrif rakhiye, that includes everything in it. You don't have to say separately. And things like this. And many times people say that, why is it not, you don't have the word like please and thank you. I say, it's not needed. One word is good enough. So these are the factors like respect for adults and see. Even today, if my teacher would walk in, I'll stand up. Here, who cares? Even the father can stand up. So these are the factors which are different. Next, please. Autonomy or autocreme is the spine of medical ethics. Informed consent is the most salient feature. Human rights, dignity, respect, trust, and confidentiality. These are all components of informed consent and autonomy. I'll quickly go through them. Next. This is the one that I'm very worried about. It happens all the time in research particularly. I used to work in Malaysia for a while as an ENT and ethics man. And there, if you have a Malay patient, it's usually the mother who will dominate. The father will say, shut up. Mother will give the typical Malay culture. A Chinese will come in, because they're Chinese also. The father will dictate whatever happens to the family. An Indian will say, Ram Ram. Do whatever you feel like. So different cultural aspects. Okay? Thank you. Next, please. Then there is a concept of tribal cultures. It's a tribal chief. This is what happens in Pakistani election today, 2 weeks ago. The tribal Vadera or the Jagirdar, he decides. When you go out, I used to do a lot of camps for WHO, for deafness and etc., etc. All we needed was convince the Vadera that, Vadera means landlord. The man, there's fiefdoms all over India and Pakistan. So if you could convince him that this is a good job, then you could do it. But if not, and particularly the mullah of that area, they would not. I'll tell you a very strange example. This happened to me. We were talking about using iodine as a protective measure for in Swat area, northern areas of Pakistan, Himalayas, etc. Goiter is pandemic. So there was a campaign WHO was doing, I was also involved in it, that we should use iodine to prevent it. And the water was being, for somehow, technically I don't remember the details, iodine was used in water. Now, the mullah was so clever, that one particular mullah I remember in Swat, he didn't like us at all. He went on the pulpit, he said, don't use this water because this water is coming from Margala and they're polluting it by iodine. In Margala, they've already taken the bijli out of it. So it's a lifeless thing. You can't even do a wuzu with it, let alone drink it. Same thing they're doing to the polio people these days. Have you seen the recent reports? They're not allowing people to do polio. It's a strange thing. So the culture there is so strong. Mullah usually goes as a cohort of the Jagirdar and Chaudhry. Next, please. But justice is universal, although not so much in Pakistan, I suppose. Is it culture sensitive? I do not think so. This is universal. And I think Brother Bhojani talked about it. Adil is the most important thing. Next, please. So autonomy is subject to moral relativism, at least informed consent is. Human rights, however, are universal, and justice is also universal. So there is a mixture of two things. You can have universal principles, also moral relativism. Both are possible in medical ethics. Next, please. Now, briefly, I'll go through about types. If I'm talking from the medical point of view, there are two types of justice that we see, distributive and retributive. Of course, this standard terminology. Next, please. Distributive means fair and equitable, appropriate. Now, this is where the question of rationing of resources comes in. Services within limited resources become a big problem. So you have X amount of money and you want to give a certain drug or do a CT or a scan or MRI, you cannot do it. It's not allowed because the managers don't like it. And they will go after you. So that's a big problem. Retributive, the punishment compatible with crime. It is not right that somebody has done a slight mistake, you chop his head, what's happening with the Taliban phenomena or whatever. There is a classical description and total dictates are given in Quran about retribution. I'm not on authority to talk about that. Dr. Bhojani can talk about it. So punishment should be compatible to the crime committed. Adl wa ihsan. It's a beautiful definition that Maulana Aqil Gharvi gave once. Very good. He said Adl is universal. Adl is an attribute of God. Ihsan is one, but several steps higher than Adl. Adl is uniform. Isar, Qurbani, Jazba, giving something away from you. person, etc., is 2 or 3 steps higher than others. Adl ihsan, and in Quran, of course, this is the famous ayat from Surah An-Nahl. Okay, next please. Ali's mandate is known to all. We read in Nahj al-Balagha. Next please. Now, research that's being carried out in the Western world is totally different to what you see in the Eastern world. I remember as a head of an institute when I was approached by a famous university to collaborate in certain clinical trials, phase 3 and phase 4 trials. And I distinctly recall the bad things that I committed. I feel bad for that now. But this is what happens. The authorities from here, from Harvard, Cambridge, etc., will go there, invite a professor or a chair, etc., to come over, visit the university, all paid for, which is, in my book, which I wrote many years ago, I said, it's called bribing the doctor to kill the patient. This is what happens, really, all the time. Anyway, so the trials are carried out with a collaboration which are not ethical. And there are several things. I remember one particular example. A lady from here went for an ethical conference in Karachi, and she gave a particular illustration, example of a research which was carried out on a particular drug used in almost dead hospice patients, terminal patients, and that study from Germany was being quoted for the drug to be effective in young, healthy mothers. See, this kind of thing, you have to be very careful. And surrogate consent is always there. If I'm a head of the institute and I know a professor here, I'll take care of the families and the patients. It goes on. All the time it happens. Now I'll give you 1 or 2, 3 prominent examples of injustice in research. Tuskegee trial is a famous one. In 1930s, this trial was started by the American authorities. I will not name them, at a particular university. And it lasted until 1972. African Americans, that is a black population of Birmingham, Alabama, they picked up X number of patients of syphilis and wanted to watch the progress from the primary to secondary tertiary stage. Penicillin was discovered in 1940s. A particular group was defined, so these will be the control and the second will be the trial. They did not give penicillin deliberately to see the effects of syphilis. And it lasted till 1972. One of those patients, somehow he survived and he came out and he became a lawyer. And he sued the government. And then it came, of course, he was the famous example where President Clinton had to come to apologize to the African race. This happened in 1979 when he apologized. AZT or AZT, placebo matter. This is the world famous one. Again, the question of distributive justice. Once you do a trial involves certain countries like Africa or Thailand or etc., that drug which you've tried there, for example, this is for HIV, as you know, once they tried and found that the vertical transmission could be reduced by 1/3 by giving to the pregnant mothers X number of times, etc., etc., they found that it was effective in France and in Germany and perhaps in USA. They withdrew the drug and took the experiment to Thailand and Africa. Once they found that it is really effective, they withdrew the drug altogether in certain people, like in particular in Thailand, did not give that. It became so expensive that ordinary people could not afford it. The worst thing they did was they used a placebo when the drug was already confirmed to be effective as a trial. It went on for a long time. And one of my colleagues, Farhat Mausam in Karachi, she was the whistleblower for this particular thing. She wrote a beautiful article in Lancet or so, and since then it's become a big thing. And this is the third example of what's happening even today, Johns Hopkins story. My son is a cardiologist in America. He showed me that film, and I couldn't believe it. This is about the blue babies when they have shunt and things. There was a famous cardiac surgeon who had an idea that somehow he could bypass the arteriovenous shunt, but he didn't know how to do it. He had a technician, a lab technician, who was an African American. He said, look, I want to do this, but can you develop a model? So this man, who was basically a carpenter or a technician or a plumber, he developed a model and went on to do an animal experimentation in cats and dogs and found the remedy to bypass the blood, the mixture of in the lungs. When he had done that, the surgeon did the operation, and in the middle of the surgery got stuck. He didn't know how to anastomose. Now, in Johns Hopkins, until 1957, an African American could not walk from the front door. So this man was hiding in the lab. So the surgeon started shouting, call so-and-so, John or whatever his name was. He said, no, you can't call him. He's black. He's not allowed. So look, the boy is dying. The baby is dying. So anyway, the man was brought in, and then people know who was the founder of that technique. So what happened next was this professor gave lectures, became a famous man. Even today, if you go to Johns Hopkins, in the main hall or corridor, you'll find two pictures, one of that and one of a pediatrician. This man retired, went to wilderness. 20 years later, this professor of cardiology, somehow his conscience bit him. He went looking for him and found him and said, look, I think I did a mistake and you should be honored. So then he was given the honor, etc., etc. But this happened in 1978. Even today, I'm sure it's happening. Quickly, we'll go to the next one. Now, there's several ethical dilemmas that we'll discuss. We have experts here sitting there. My question is, can a non-Muslim organ be transplanted into a Muslim patient? Recently, we had a wonderful meeting in Najaf and Kufa, only a couple of months ago. And we did discuss that. Some very learned audience there. I'll talk about it later. There is the concept of taharat of organ after it has been implanted or transplanted in human body, and Qasim will tell us more about it later. Next, please. This is the fundamental thing at the moment, which is going on throughout the world. Can the embryos be used for harvesting the stem cells? Is embryo alive? And how do you obtain the stem cells? Well, the good news is that this debate probably is the last time that we are talking about. Because now embryos are not needed, you can get stem cells from the skin. And new technologies are coming up. But it's worth discussing. And I think we would like to discuss in the meeting. Surrogacy, another concept, and I think Brother discussed briefly about it. There is, when I was in Babylon, Professor Musa, who's an Iraqi obstetrician, you might know her, she gave a wonderful talk about surrogacy. And she gave me this thought that the concept of surrogacy was prevalent in the times of Prophet Abraham. And that was called Babylonian law of antiquity. That if the wife could not bear the child, she could ask her maid or somebody else to bear the child, and then the child would be owned by us. This was the law prevalent in those days. And that is my question to this learned audience, very respectfully. Was that the story between Hajj? And you might have an answer. Very common story in African tribes, shared motherhood. Polyandry is a common thing in certain tribes. There are different types of surrogacy, and I'm going to. And there is this concept of muta, which is, at the moment, even today, prevalent in Iran. And there are lots of discussions on the subject, and I don't have the time to go into it, but maybe we can discuss later. Next. End of life, Brother talked about it, and that was a beautiful thing. I'm going to use it next time, la haraj. There comes a time, and we had a wonderful debate, I think Qasim was there in Najaf last year, when Maulanas will not agree with me. They kept pestering. We were discussing about brain death. And said, no, doctor must keep doing till the... Said, we've tried, we've failed. It's terminal, you can't do anything. What do we do now? Maulanas will not agree. Now I've got the answer. I'm going to quote them, la haraj. And there is this concept, Then there comes a time when you are using those resources which should not be used on that. It's a wasteful resource. I think doctors who are in the audience would probably know it. There is this concept of Mullah Sadra's transcendence and extent, and this is a philosophy which I will not go into it. But ruh is eternal. The body stays here, right? So why delay or prolong the process of dying? Don't delay unless there is a reason for it. There is a famous quote on transcendence by Rumi. I have it on my iPad. I can show you. It's beautiful. It was written about 300 years ago, how the life cycle starts from vegetation to animal to this and this. And recently, I read a beautiful article by a chap called Richard Dawkins. It's not Richard Dawkins, somebody else wrote it, but Richard Dawkins is a famous philosopher. He edited the book about the carbon cycle. The first carbon molecule that stayed in the glaciers or in the stars came to the glaciers, to the mountains, to the tree. And the tree was eaten by the animal was eaten by us, and we went to the grave, and the insects ate us. The carbon molecule continues. It's an amazing story. Life is so full of, there's so much to learn, I tell you. And this concept of when to withdraw withhold treatment. Should nutrition also be withdrawn towards the end? Very debatable question. Next. Qasim doesn't agree with me. He has had debates on Hidayat TV with me on this. Should we follow the DNR orders or not? Sometimes difficult. I'll tell you a recent example. A friend of mine, I think you probably know him, he's a famous neurophysician in America, Professor Duke. His father had the same problem, you just mentioned him. At a cardiac arrest, the CPR team came over, and they said, look, he's dying, let him go. I said, no, show us the DNR form. There was no DNR form. They kept on pumping it. The family was crying, leave him, let him go, let him go. Create a big problem. Later on became a court case. So there is an issue here. Should we leave a will and write down about our own fate if nobody else's? Then there's a concept, this designer baby is obsolete now. It is one discussion which I think we should close down. Gene splicing is very relevant. The next generation of doctors will be talking about eugenics. And this is happening all the time. I mean, if, for example, somebody's got dead cochlea and you can remove that dead genetic, whatever fault is there, and put a new one, so generations will improve, how wonderful that be. And that is also applicable to stem cells. Cloning was a major issue. Iran gave the fatwa that cloning in animals allowed, and I think others followed. Iran has been very pragmatic, and I must compliment Dr. Larijani, who really is, and Fazlullah Zahiri. Great people. They are so pragmatic. They have given wonderful things about muta and surrogacy and the use of third gamete and when to use it, when not to use it. It's amazing. They are probably the people who guide the fuqaha, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and others, I'm sure, because they're very, very, it's a joy reading them. Also, I'd like to mention the name of a gentleman called Mansoor Sinai. You should read his papers on embryonic research, stem cell research. It's all from Iran. Iran is amazing. They're really doing a marvelous job. And a lady called Catherine Inhorn, who's done PhD on the Shia fiqh and the concept of gamete transfer. It's a beautiful book that she's written, going through the entire philosophy of ijtihad and fuqah and what's the role and what the brother told us about the tier system, and then coming to this concept as to whether muta can be allowed or not. There is a lot of debate going on. In Lebanon, special clinics have opened up where even the non-Shia women of certain age who have problems go and they seek this muta arrangement where physical contact is not necessary. You see, muta is a very controversial subject and probably we'll discuss it later. And then this the question which was asked recently. I was asked this question in Najaf, in the Kufa meeting. What happens to the organs in England or UK? I don't know. I thought it all goes to the clinical waste. You people. Yeah, but do they bury them? Are they? Unless you give an authority or a will. Yes. You have to give instruction. But mostly it's the clinical waste where it goes. Yeah. Okay. This is what I'd like to share with you, which over the years I've learned. This is a triangle of applied ethics. Knowledge gives you power. Whether you use it for good or bad, that's your choice. Skills tells you how to apply that knowledge. Atomic radiation for cancer treatment or for blowing the world. It's up to you. It is the third thing, conscience, that determines. Conscience is like a scaffolding, like that on a seesaw, that fulcrum on which you balance. If the knowledge and skill and your conscience allows that you're doing for a good thing, then that act is ethical. If not, then it's unethical. But how do you know the conscience? Conscience is batin. Its tangible form is justice. And that is where I'll conclude. That justice is the pillar of ethics. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Professor Shabir Henderson. That was an excellent speech, and even though I heard it before, I have to say that I continue to learn more and more. And as you can see, knowledge is an ever-evolving process. There's no end to it. No one person has the right answers. And Dr. Shabir Henderson's speech actually left a lot of thought-provoking questions. there's a lot to be answered still. So on that note, I'd like to invite back Dr. Shabih Zaidi and Dr. Ali Raza Pujani to the panel. Now with him, I'd like to invite Dr. Ali Fanai, who's an expert, a scholar, and he spent 17 years in Imamia under the most esteemed Ayatullahs. Now, Dr. Ali Raza Pujani went to the extent of saying that Dr. Fanai is his mentor in the matters of morality and law in Shiism. So it's a great privilege to have him, but above all, it's also a great privilege to have Dr. Muhammad Walji, who is a senior general practitioner who has served your community well over the last so many years. And we'd like to have, if you like, a perspective from primary care into the issues that he has faced over the years. Now, we also have amongst us Mr. Dr. Ahsan Zafar Zaidi, who is a consultant surgeon at St. Heliers and Epsom Hospital in London, who will lend the secondary care perspective, especially from the point of view of surgery. He himself states that he's a student of medical ethics. So we have, a varying perspective. There are a lot of questions to be answered. The first question actually will be from me to Mr. Dr. Syed Jafri. Could you please answer the question that Professor Shabih Zaidi actually posed on when does an organ become tahir?
I think my level is obviously much lower than our esteemed scholars, and I would, rather than commenting on that, I would just rather start this thought-provoking discussion on one principle of Islam, and especially in Shias, is that our organs are given to us by God, and as soon as the soul leaves our body, this amanat becomes God's amanat, and that has to be buried. And in that concept, if that concept holds in the same principle of organ transplantation, that we are allowed, why? Actually, I would ask our esteemed scholars here, that why is that in Islam we are allowed to take the organ from a non-tahir person to survive, and yet we are not allowed to give our organs as an organ transplant to some other person?
Is there somebody amongst the panel who might be able to assist with this?
We've had this discussion in Delhi in a very august gathering, and we could not get an answer. The IMI logo states that we should save the life. If you've saved the life of one, it is as if you've saved the life of the entire mankind. And as such, there should be no, in fact, Maulana Kalbi Sadiq said, I agree with Ahsan, I do not know, I'm not a faqih, but a Hindu should also get an organ from us. That was the end point in the Delhi conference. And I do not know what the fuqaha, we've got very eminent scholars sitting here. I was very impressed, Dr. Raza. You have really opened doors for discussion. And we will learn. I learned a lot. I'm glad that I came here because the way you, we keep reading articles on fiqh. We read, the way you explain ahkam, adl. My only comment is to this audience, we are very lucky. And I was telling Dr. Ali Raza, we are very lucky. Number one, we are the only people who believe in ilm. And believe me, ilm was the first attribute which won Adam the battle. Adam won the battle not because he was a prophet, but he answered the question. It was the ilm. And this I read in Ali Shariati's monograph, that it was ilm which gave, the attribute which nobody had. And in our fiqh, we've got ijtihad. I would respectfully also ask you, Dr. Ali, that we should have mujtahid in all the fields. It is not, it's physically impossible for one Maulana, one mujtahid to be, a perfect fit for everything. We should have a mujtahid who can give a fatwa on ethics. We should have a mujtahid who can give fatwa on medicine, on law. And we are very grateful. I mean, Iran has done a lot of work, and we will think that we are the best race. We've got ilm, and why should not we have ilm? We believe in the Babul and the Madinah Institute. Thank you.
So I'll pose this question to Dr. Ali Fanai. Do you have, what's your perspective on this matter?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. I think you are right in saying that our body is amana from Allah before we die and after we die. But the question is, what is our moral and religious responsibility with regard to our body? What we should do with this amana? It is clear that the person who is died does not have any responsibility with regard to his own body. This is the responsibility of others. But I think it is very controversial to think that if there are different choices here, the only thing that we should do is to bury that body. Especially if the life of someone else is at issue, at stake here. We can argue by saying that based on rationality, based on reason as one independent source of Sharia, that the best use of this amana is to use it to save the life of others.
So does our fiqh allows this? That's the question.
It depends on the framework in which a faqih is working, is doing his ijtihad. I think if we acknowledge that reason is an independent source of Sharia on the one hand, and on the other hand, if we acknowledge that morality is prior to religion and Sharia, by putting together these two presuppositions, we can justify this conclusion.
Is there any variation between the ijtihad systems, between different marja' taqleeds on this matter? Dr. Al Pujani?
I should just first of all clarify, I very much appreciate the way I've been received, but I'm in the process of submitting a PhD, so I'm not a doctor at the moment. And I speak just with Dr. Fanai's permission. In the question of the overview which I gave of the framework of ijtihad, so that I think that's an honest overview of the dominant framework in modern Shia usul al-fiqh. So we're talking post Sheikh Murtaza Ansari and continuing till this day. And as I said, that theoretically there's this near unanimity of rationality having its independent role. And I did make a note on the presentation that for the majority of fuqaha, rationality is only being used to interpret textual evidences. And this placing it Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', Aqal, it isn't fulfilling its theoretical role for the majority of fuqaha. So there is diversity in the way this fiqhi system is being applied by fuqaha. And again, in my concluding comments, real life questions which are coming from economists on one side, which are coming from medical professionals on the other hand, is pushing fiqhi discourse. But I do firmly believe that the resources in Shia fiqh give us huge optimism to say that we can adequately respond to these questions, morally and spiritually informed. And obviously I'm a student, I firmly agree that it is rational morality which holds a key in this case of answering these questions such as organ donation and across the spectrum of biomedical ethical issues.
I have a question in response to this question. Is blood an organ?
It is an organ. It is an organ. You get a host and a donor reaction.
It is the most active
organ in the body.
In the body.
And if a blood can be given to a non-Muslim, why not an organ?
Oil taken from a non-Muslim. That's weird.
Dr. Bharti, you work in a very diverse community. I mean, cosmopolitan would be the politically correct word, but in a sense you work amongst people of varying backgrounds. What sort of examples have you come across recently where you are sort of put into a dilemma which you find often difficult?
I thoroughly enjoyed the first two lectures. Ali Raza's was brilliant and yours was thoroughly enjoyable. After a long time I heard some marvelous lectures and I'm so pleased that I came. Things are different. The world is changing. And my disappointment is mainly towards our Maulanas. And to some extent ourselves, because we keep asking our Maulanas, is this allowed? Is this not allowed? Is this allowed? And how can you ask an SHO? And I consider Maulanas in the normal Imam Baz like SHOs. How would you ask an SHO a complex consultant matter and then to follow it? And of course there are those things which were applicable in the 7th century Arabia, which are now interpreted or applied everywhere. For example, the other day I saw one of our members sitting and drinking water when everybody around him was walking and pushing him around. And so I asked him, why are you doing this? And he said, Maulana says it is sunnah to sit down and you drink water. Now, of course, in 7th century Arabia, standing in the middle of the desert and drinking, you'll have sand in your water. But the way things are going around, like for example, you must not pass water standing, you must sit down. We go to Western conferences where there are only urinals. Now, what are you supposed to do? So there are those sort of things which are around us, and things are changing so fast that we really need guidance from scholars and people who know what they're talking about. Now, things which I'm coming across in my practice, I've been a GP in Birmingham, in inner city, majority Muslim population, and I see these things. For example, as you know, with the advancement of genetics, we are now operating on patients who have got no disease, but there is a genetic identification of, for example, cancer of the breast. A woman with no cancer, with no tumor, with no lump, but we are removing their breast because we can identify these things. Now, I wonder whether the fuqaha and the ulamas, where do they stand? I have a number of questions to and I'm sure my medical colleagues will share this with me, but mainly to the ulamas, that, for example, I have a couple who comes in and says, we can't have children, we want IVF. Now, if it is a husband and wife, it is straightforward. But what if it isn't husband and wife? Am I supposed to say, I don't want to help you? The other day, I had two lesbian women who said that they wanted an IVF from a donor, and they wanted a GP's permission, because the funding will come from a general practitioner. What am I supposed to do here? Homosexuality is against Islam, we know. But you have a patient sitting in front of you, and they are homosexuals. Are you going to treat them or not? Of course you're going to treat them, but what should be your attitude? And what about Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy Anil Munkar? Shall I start preaching them? And in fact, as you know, homosexuality with this recent
Leicester, a doctor from Leicester, he said, I won't see the homosexual, so he was suspended.
So there are all these sort of questions which are coming around. And for example, termination of pregnancy, it is not allowed. Agreed. But if a girl was raped, Would you allow? When you say Maulana or ulama will say, no, it's not allowed. What if the girl was your sister and she was raped by a criminal? And I would really actually, if an alim said it is not allowed, I would actually want to speak to God himself and say, would you stop me from doing this? So sometimes for ulamas, it is easy to pontificate, I'm sorry to use that word, but sometimes I think the ulamas need to come down to earth and mingle with people and see what life is. IVF, euthanasia. Euthanasia is very common, and in fact, as you doctors know, we're actually practicing passive euthanasia all the time. But
yeah,
yes,
Liverpool care pathway.
Yes, but do you know that? And ulama doesn't know that this is what we are doing. And I personally believe that, of course, this is where aql comes, where morality comes. Do you want to prolong suffering in a person when he is dying, just because the SHO has, Maulana SHO has said, nahi kar sakte. You know, so what about extramarital affairs and extramarital activity which is going on? Now, for example, I have a Muslim girl who is enrolled in extramarital activity. Am I supposed to pontificate? Am I supposed to say, no, you can't do this? Am I supposed to tell her parents? So all these things which we GPs in inner city, in Muslim areas are coming across this. I don't really believe that an alim in Iran, where homosexuality, I'm sure it exists, but it is not on the surface, so they may probably not know what's going on. But here, recent laws, it's almost normal nowadays. So those sort of things do bug us, and it would be nice to have some sort of guidance.
Right. Could we have some guidance? How do we sort of, these are very profound questions. These are issues that we face in day-to-day life. Yes, we have come across people who do not have an Islamic lifestyle, who we are forbidden from sort of, having anything to do with that kind of lifestyle. Where do we draw the line?
Let me just answer one question. About the infertile couple. If they're Shias, I think in certain situations muta would be allowed. And muta does not always mean physical contact. It's a temporary contract. They have arrangement. The woman comes, sits out and behind the curtain. She doesn't even see the person. She donates, she gets married like for muta, donates the ovum, then sperm from the husband of the infertile, of the other one who has the problem is taken, and then it's the petri dish is fertilized. Once it's implanted into the wife's uterus, the muta is broken. This is being practiced. Ayatollah Al-Khamenei has given a mandate. Ayatollah Sayyid Sistani says, take care. And recently in Kufa and Najaf, I had a wonderful discussion with learned people. And they gave me different fatwa as well. It is controversial. Ayatollah Bashir Najafi is very pragmatic. So there are different people. Again, like you said, there is a whole diverse thing in fiqh that's happening. That's one. About the person who comes, and if you feel that you should not do it because morally you think it's wrong, although it is extremely difficult, and things general practice is quite difficult, but in our practices, I would ask my colleague to see that. I mean, I had a patient who was a blind person with a dog, and the dog was very cuddly and friendly, wanted to sit on my chair, on my lap. I said, look, I'll ask Mr. Sinha to see him.
So in a sense, that answers the question very easily. If you have somebody of a different persuasion, of an alternative lifestyle, as we would say today, that certainly is an option. Is there anybody else who'd like to add to that? Now, before we move on to Mr. Jaffrey, could I say that, we would like to involve you all. We've got a young man right at the back who's got, slips of paper. If you feel like, sending any questions, then that's one way of doing it. Otherwise, please put your hands up and, I'll come to you.
Can you collect the papers?
What's that?
And if anybody wants to show their hands and want to ask the question directly, and
that's a
or if they want to write down.
Otherwise, you can write and send questions through.
Just want to add to all your questions, but I think I just got a couple of them picked up. Just a very interesting story. I think you're all aware of Maulana Sadiq. Maulana Sadiq had been in this field for a long time, and he had been conversing, writing letters to Ayatollah Khoui as well. In 1970s, when this Hassan Abdi developed a bank, and in those days, obviously working in a bank from the Shia perspective is not allowed. You're directly dealing with the finances. So he wrote a letter to Ayatollah Khoui and asked him that this man is a Shia man who's building a bank and will help our Shia brothers, be very good for the community. And he wrote a 3-page letter explaining him about his case. And a one-liner came back from Ayatollah Khoui, only one liner. And he wrote back, "We do not make fiqh, we only investigate and tell you." So this says it all, that they investigate it so thoroughly, they don't make it. They extract it and they just give it to you, as you have rightly alluded in your presentation. The other aspect which I just want to touch as well, that I used to have the same concept about the fuqaha, all the ayatollahs, that they're sitting in a small place in Najaf, and how would they know about all of this? What's going on, the dilemmas in this Western modern world, it's going so fast. But you will be fascinated that this is my first-hand experience. Imam Hussain has given me the opportunity of visiting Karbala several times, and hence Najaf also. So I had several meetings with Ayatollah Bashir Najfi, and I was amazed, and I was really shocked what he knew about medicine. I came there one day to do a workshop on female incontinence, but there was nobody else doing this female incontinence over there, so I was teaching them. And he said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "I'm just doing a workshop." He said, "What workshop?" I said, "Workshop about doing the incontinence, when the females leak urine, and it's very embarrassing for them, and the taharat and all that." He said, "Yes. So you're going to devise some kind of a sling which will support their bladder so that the bladder doesn't descend down and the leakage stops." I was startled. I saw stars in the daytime. And I said, how did this man, who has no knowledge of medicine, knew exactly what a lot of specialists don't know? They don't understand the complex pelvic floor muscles. And this man, sitting in the corner of Najaf, knew exactly to the point, and in 30 seconds he explained me the mechanism of incontinence and the treatment of that, for a lot of specialists in the current modern world would have no idea about. So this is our level of our fuqaha, who knows and understands when they do certain kind of things. But with all due respect, my view on that would be that if some homosexual comes or lesbian comes or somebody who's that kind of person comes and asks you for consultation, I think as a moral duty, I am a doctor only over there, and I'm not an Islamic preacher over there. My moral duty would be to treat him, his medical condition, and put his morality and his other issues on the side and deal him as a human being that God has created, and I am just a person who's trying to help him out, and that's all. Thank you.
Do these two gentlemen agree?
I think the issue is very complicated, and we can't say the final word here. But I would like to say something about what is going wrong in the current method of ijtihad, that because of this we have some unacceptable result. One problem that we have got is that a mujtahid, when he's trying to issue a verdict regarding new issues, he has to be scientifically and medically, economically, politically informed. Otherwise, he hasn't done his best, and done his best is the very meaning of ijtihad. Ijtihad is to do your best to find out the real ruling of Sharia. And if someone is not informed enough about the subject matter of that ruling, this kind of ijtihad is not acceptable. And the other problem that we have got here is that with regard to the Quran and Sunnah, there are many theological and philosophical presuppositions that the interpreter should take into account in order to be able to infer something from these sources. One of them is about the method of interpretation. And the dominant method of interpretation at the moment is what you may call it literal interpretation. But literal interpretation is not suitable for all verses of the Quran and all the riwayah that we have got. I think we should divide what we have got in the Quran and Sunnah into two parts. The literal method of interpretation is suitable for part of the Quran and Sunnah. But for the rest of it, we have to use another method. You may call it cultural interpretation. This is because the meaning of revelation is that something comes down to the level of understanding of ordinary people. And in order for ordinary people to understand what God is trying to communicate with them, God has to borrow from them their language and their culture. So what we have got in the Quran and Sunnah is a combination of pure revelation and the Arabic culture of the time of revelation. Therefore, in order to apply those principles to our own situation, we have to separate the Arabic culture of that time from the pure principles that are eternal and that are applicable to all circumstances.
Yeah, just to, obviously these questions of interpretation are central to the evolving ijtihad. Ijtihad is an evolving process. So what have the fuqaha said? The fuqaha are learning and being pushed by this discourse, and they must be pushed by the grassroots discourse. Yeah? But in terms of a couple of practical things which have come out from the comments, I think in terms of a duty to preach to somebody when they come in front of us, even within a traditional method, Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy al Munkar, one of the central conditions for the obligation is there must be the possibility of effect. Okay, so we don't have that obligation. So even if it's a Muslim, even if we believe that it's a Muslim person in front of us, yeah, and we feel they're not praying their salah, if we think my saying to them, pray salah, is not going to have any effect, I don't have an obligation to say so. So the homosexual couple coming to my room, the last thing I have to worry about is that. On the question of IVF and muta, you mentioned it's a controversial manner of doing it. And to me, this is a symptom of the problems we have in our system of ijtihad, to be honest with you. Okay, because it's a pure, just to clarify what's going on, is if there's an egg or sperm coming from an extramarital partner, like we said, the actual notion of egg implantation under permissibility is fine, if we accepted the sort of reasoning I alluded to. Where's the problem coming is they're saying, well, this is extramarital relations. So let's solve it. Let's make a formal contract of a temporary marriage, a fixed-term marriage, to allow for the relations. This is a pure formalistic use of fiqh, which is morally in a vacuum. It doesn't consider any of the... So I said that a problem may be is genealogical problems. You know, amongst some of the early fuqaha, and amongst the maqasid of Sharia, is nasr. Now, maintaining social integrity. To me, that's a real concern, is social integrity from IVF, which has massive moral implications and should be the concern of the fuqaha. Not whether, you know, I can conduct a 10-minute marriage. Okay, so to me, yeah, it is a solution which is being used, but to me it's a symptom of some of the limits we have in our current system.
Correction, IVF is not controversial. been mandated.
Sorry, the
It's basically the third party can be transferred.
Third party can be
We'll be getting questions from the floor in a minute.
Assalamu alaikum. Well chosen topics and very well good presentation by the panel. A few things I want to share with the others, with my experience working in this country as an anesthetist since the 90s. First, there is a patient asking you for help, treatment, and there is a wish they want. I worked in many hospitals where they asked me to give anesthetic to termination, not on medical basis, but the patient, which that's another issue. And I worked as well in a center, national center in this country, where they do gender change, and they asked me to give anesthetic. I remember one of the patients was Jewish, the surgeon, Judge of England White, and the anesthetist Muslim. What do you do? Now, when I search before I do any of these terminations or gender change, and ask even from the staff, and what's my obligation as a doctor, and I'm not interested in this, and I get a huge support from the department, you have the right to say, no, I'm not going to give anesthetic to that patient, you can ask someone else. And we have a list of anesthetists who give anesthetic to termination on non-medical, as well as for gender change, and that's been many hospitals. So you have choices, luckily in this country, with the regulation of GMC, not to proceed, because they are not a patient. Thank you.
Can I just add one sentence here? One of the principles of medical ethics is that the patient has a right to demand treatment and you are under obligation to provide one. But you also have liberty not to provide it. You have equal rights. If the patient wants to withdraw the treatment or withdraw from the treatment, he has a right. You also have an option as a physician. You can volunteer. GMC will not rule against that because it's a question of autonomy. As a human being, that I want to dictate my rights, and I'm not happy with this treatment. It happens.
There are many doctors who do not do vasectomy. Yeah, as you said, I know of all my Catholic friends, they don't do vasectomies. They will not. They'll pass the patient to somebody else. And the GMC agrees with that.
This is the freedom and justice.
You see, what we are doing now is we are looking for how to opt out. That has always been there, but that is not facing the real problem. How do we practice in the West? You see, you are suggesting opt-out, escapism really. We really need from the fuqaha and from the ulamas a better guidance.
But there are SHOs.
Yes, there's a job.
Consultants.
We're looking at the consultants. You see, you can do that, but I'm a single-handed GP.
That's very difficult.
And a lesbian couple asks me to refer them for IVF. And I am going to fund this from the budget which I've been given. Now, how can I work in this country? And you see, actually, when it comes down to what we are doing now is to circumvent, going around and around. We are looking for escape. I will not do it, but I'll ask him to do it. But when it comes to brass tacks, when it comes to working in this country, it is going to become very difficult, and you will have to compromise. And this is why young doctors, our Shia young doctors, their mindset is changing, and they are now coming around to accepting that these sort of things which are going around is going to be a norm. So lesbians or homosexuals who want to have children, those sort of things are becoming normal, and they are going to use their judgment or use what is normal and go ahead. But for GPs or single-handed GPs like us, we are in a dilemma.
But excuse me, you remind me about the brother of other scholars who, many questions I come across people in this country asking, oh, we are Iraqi or coming to this country and work in a shop and selling haram meat or anything else, is that allowed? And few of the answers, correct me if I'm wrong, it's allowed to sell it for those who consume it, non-Muslims. So I don't know whether that's similar to your treatment.
It's not allowed. I think as far as I know, it's not allowed even to sell for the ordinary people. But can I just, I think there are many questions now, so I might just not take time, just 30 seconds. The lesbian, the homosexuals, and extramarital affairs and living together, these are all abnormal issues. And I don't think Fuqaha, I'm not sure, maybe I'm wrong, Fuqaha would never have a definitive answer for that, because this is not a normal situation of Islamic living people. So we have to find an escape. I don't think so there is anything else we can do about it, but that's my own view.
This is actually an issue that's been very divisive in this country, as we know from recent events, and I think it's going to sort of dominate the landscape of ethical discussion for some time to come. I was reading recently how certain taboos of say 50 or 60 years ago now have become very accepted norms. And I think it is important for us to keep this discussion going so that a taboo remains a taboo and not an accepted norm. We'll move away from that subject and we'll just continue very quickly on to surrogacy. There's a question from the floor. Somebody has sent a question that we mentioned muta as a way around to surrogacy. What if the child who's born wants to know about his true mother, donor? What about that situation?
Beautiful question. This I have debated in my recent book, which has gone to the spring of a publication. This question was posed in Kufa also, Najaf, when we had a meeting last year. And I thought and thought and thought. In 2005, a legislation has come through in England, in the UK. Before that, anonymity was allowed, not anymore. Now, the children who are born of such a thing, not what I'm talking about the IVF and third party, etc., or sperm donation, they have a right to know the parenthood. Now that is where the question starts with legal inheritance and legal rights. And there is a fatwa which is available from, I think it's Ayatollah Ali Sistani, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, about the legal rights. The legal rights is that, it's very complex, I'm just trying to remember, I've got it here, that it's like adoption. The sperm donor, the father, he can give the name. No, he cannot give the name. The name will be of the father who was infertile, the name from the father. But inheritance, legal rights will come from the sperm donor. In the mother's case, it's a different thing. Mother, the biological mother, as well as the donor mother, both have equal rights, but the mother who's a recipient is more like adoptive mother, like the adopting father. Muhammad bin Abi Bakr was adopted son of Ali alayhi salam, but name would not change. Yeah. Right? So there is a fatwa available, and I'll be happy to give it, and my book has discussed it at length.
Right, we have a question from a doctor who tells us that she is a medical registrar, and I'd be grateful if you could introduce yourself and ask a question.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Suhaila. I'm a respiratory registrar as well as a medical registrar. My question is, I find myself many times on call having to make sealing of care decisions, which inevitably end up being resource driven. How am I to justify, for example, it's best if I just exemplify it with, if I have a patient who is, say, elderly, very frail, and have a pneumonia, say, developed that in hospital, and I know that probably taking them to intensive care, intubating them, wouldn't be of much benefit. But now with the advent of something like non-invasive ventilation, I know that might perhaps just prolong things for them, but maybe won't cure them or change their long-term prognosis. Knowing that, and if I'm not able to, say, for example, take them to high dependency, how would I be able to justify that to myself, saying that, yes, I know I could have given you this, but I'm not able to, one, because maybe my bosses would be very annoyed with me, and secondly, I just won't be able to take you up to high dependency. How do I justify that?
This is the same answer for DNR.
It's basically the question of services within limited resources. See, the whole concept, medical ethics has changed over the years. There was a paternalistic approach initially. The doctor's order was the last order. Patient will not raise a voice. When that changed and it became managed health service, the management came from America, the doctor became a provider, health provider, and a patient became a client. So now you have a contract. So when you have a contract, you have to be very careful in signing the contract. And that is what has led to defensive medicine. And this is the whole philosophy of defensive medicine. That you want to defend yourself, morally you feel that you should do something, legally you have problems because the manager is not giving you the funds, you have no resources available, what do you do? The answer is not easy. The answer is basically that if you have 2 patients and 1 ventilator, one patient is sick and elderly and dying of terminal illness with pulmonary infection, whatever, and a young cardiac arrest, whatever, needs a ventilator, you should choose the young patient. That is where the concept of maslaha comes in. However, having said this, I must warn you that the young patient may not live long afterwards, even though you put on a ventilator. And the old person may still live for 100 years. How do you determine it?
Can I just share something?
Sure.
You see, this we see all the time, this sort of situation. And I personally believe that I don't think this is something which you need, not I, if I was in that situation, I really wouldn't like to go and ask an alim or a scholar. I think here your own akhl, your own judgment, your own intellect, your own conscience will guide you what to do. And as you were saying, in fact, I remember when I was a casualty officer in one of the hospitals, those days the resources were very limited, and I was the only doctor in casualty, and 2 cardiac arrests came. One was 90 and one was 60. And there was only one nurse, and I told the nurse, leave that 90-year-old man. We will concentrate on the 60-year-old man, and we will try and resuscitate and see what we can do. And I remember going on and on for about 3 hours, and the patient died. And about 2 hours later, the 90-year-old got up and said, where's my breakfast? So, when you make this judgment, Allah knows His maslahat, and He will decide eventually. And we have to do our best, and we have to use our judgment. And I don't think the ulamas have all the answers. Sometimes you have to use your own judgment.
While you're a registrar, you are actually not shouldering any responsibility. The ultimate responsibility is of the consultant concerned and the trust. We do not have the proprietorship of any patient now after patients have been pooled. So what you do is, if you think that this patient needs HD or ITU treatment, you write down in the notes it would be beneficial for the patient. There is an ITU registrar, there's an ITU consultant who will come and weigh those options and prioritize, as Professor Shabi said. Your responsibility, your conscience is clear, you have done your best. You cannot, cure everybody.
But what do you do if you're a consultant?
Oh, if I'm a consultant, yes. If I'm a consultant, I will also, I will fight, because we face this every day. We've got a very sick patient, we want to operate. But we know, Ali, that if we don't put him on an HDU bed or an ITU bed, he will die. So, we keep asking the ITU consultants, and we make them, so much, we go around them so much that they say, okay, if you operate, we'll keep him in the, ITU for 24 hours. And then sometimes we'll keep you in HDU, and we circumvent that. The majority of the times, I can tell you, I've had, in this last month, I've had 2 patients we never expected they'd live. They've all gone home. Yes. We thought, they'll die, they've gone home.
This is the concept of DNR,
Yeah.
But can I just add to what I understood? But her question, I think, is mainly from you to say that morally and ethically, what is our duty? What is her duty morally and ethically? Should she, despite the fact that the resources are down and the consultant might get angry, should she morally, ethically, religiously, as a duty is to carry on giving the treatment?
Yeah, of course.
Is that answer your question?
I think one of the things I was trying to point at in my presentation is that these issues are contextual and situational. Yes, so I agree you can't get a recipe from any faqih to solve these problems. But I think another thing which may be, and again, I'm not a doctor, nor am I a faqih, all right, so maybe I shouldn't be speaking here at all. Okay, but one of the things which may ease this type of moral conscience is good to see the moral conscience for a start from doctors, but and we should thank Allah for that, actually. It's a flippant comment, but we should thank Allah for that. Okay, all right, we've been driven by a defensive mechanism, but this conscience, like it came in your presentation, right? This is a grace from God, actually. All right, but to maybe if it may ease, you know, even the consultant's pressure isn't a social moral discourse, right? So this pressure for resources is also in a fallible system, in a flawed system, but an attempt to distribute resources. Okay, so those political decisions which are being made, okay, all right, we may not agree with the money which is going to Iraq or to Afghanistan in a war, instead of going to resuscitation wards. Okay, but still, even within the hospital framework, there's a desire to spread resources for the betterment of patient care. So that pressure is not an immoral pressure. Okay, there are moral decisions which are going on there as well, moral choices which are going on there as well. And maybe we feel it at the sharp end because of our own individual moral conscience. But the complexity is that broad. You know, these are moral questions of where do we give our resources? Okay, to cleaning the streets or to the hospital. We can't do both, we have to do both. So there is pressures here, and an individual can't solve all the problems.
We have a question here from Dr. Bhajani Senior.
I think my question was partly answered by Dr. Walji, who put it very nicely to say that sometimes it's not an option to opt out at the sharp end in primary care. And my original question, which I think has been already debated, was that I often get both Muslim and non-Muslim girls seeking contraception, and I don't have an option to say I won't do it because of the type of practice I'm in. And I've agonized about this for 20, 30 years, and my approach has been pragmatic. I try my very best to counsel them. I try to persuade them. I give them time to reconsider. But it's not my job to preach to them or to dictate to them what they must or must not do. After given adequate time, adequate explanation, if they still insist that they want to have a termination, then I end up referring them. And I think that that's a pragmatic approach that we have to take as health professionals in many other instances as well. And the moral decision and the agony stays with me. And I wish I was a stronger personality, as many others might be, and say, oh, I will resign from my job because this is a moral challenge I just can't accept. And I think that option isn't open to many people.
It must be difficult for you to sleep at night, sir.
It can be.
Because these are difficult decisions.
Could I suggest that, you know, if you look at it, this may be a moral dilemma in one case out of the many thousands that you've treated and benefited. Yeah. You'd have to sort of, you know, put things in balance. This is my very humble opinion.
Your conscience is clear. Just one thing about the fuqaha, we have condemned them, but wholeheartedly called them and said you are raised up. Which is not really right, because they are learned people, they are very scholarly people. And Al-Qasim said, but yes, even they can commit mistakes. There's a famous example that Maulana Ali Raza Rizvi told me about. We were having a discussion for Hidayat TV when this thing came up, that a certain woman died towards the later part of the pregnancy. People came over, what should we do with the child? So the answer was given by the faqih of the time, that buried him. Mother and live child both. Right? You know the story? Can you narrate it better? Anyway, I'll just say what Dr. Imamia said. Anyway, so the buried and went home. Oh, it's a true story then. Okay, so 20 years later, or X number of years later, this gentleman, Sheikh Mufid, was going somewhere, and this young man, a certain young man came and said, Sheikh, Assalamu alaikum. He said, who are you? He said, well, I'm sorry, but you know, the story is that my mother was married, etc. And somehow I escaped. He said, was it married? And you gave the answer. Then he went back looking for it. He said, no, that did not happen. What happened was that my uncle who was going to marry, he went somewhere, and suddenly a gentleman came from somewhere and said, no, don't marry. Let the child be delivered, which is tomorrow or something. And once the baby was delivered, then they buried the woman. So the faqih said, he was very sad about the whole thing. So he went to his maraqaba, and then he preached to Imam Zamana. And Imam stopped. He stopped. Then Imam Zamana came in his dream. He said, you had given a wrong fatwa. I came in to save that child. And the child is a miracle of Al-Bayt. Wow. And that is why Shaykh Hafiz has written that even we can be wrong and we seek guidance from Imam Zamana at all times. After that you can't condemn them.
No, we're not condemning them at all. In fact, they are our life and our soul, our ulamas and fuqahas. What I am trying to say is that we need guidance from them. Guidance for people like here. Now, there are about 20,000 Shias in England, in UK. Now, if you look at the overall scheme of things, of 300 million Shias, 20,000 may not be an important number. And so it may not be in the radar that, you know, this small community living in England have got some serious problems, but they may not be very significant or important. But for people living here, we are in a dilemma. And so this is why it's a plea that we need guidance. We need guidance because otherwise life is becoming very difficult.
Join IMI.
There's a book by Ayatollah Sistani which has been translated, The Code of Practice for the People Living in the West. And I think that gives a very good guidance of all of this.
Yes, absolutely. But it doesn't cover most of what we are facing.
You can ask the question.
I think with regard to very specific situations, no one can tell us what to do. Neither a mushtahid nor a moral philosopher, even know the law, because what we have got here is just general guidance. We have several general principles, and we don't know exactly which one is suitable for this particular situation. What we need here, I think, is what Aristotle called it practical wisdom. You have to develop inside yourself this kind of virtue, practical wisdom, in order to be able to recognize which principle is the best suitable principle for this particular situation.
We've got one final question before we sort of, wind this meeting up.
Assalamu alaikum. I just had one question before. I just want to make a very quick comment on Suhaila's question. One part that wasn't mentioned in the discussion when you discussed the elderly patient there was almost this difficulty in saying that it might be futile to treat. We didn't discuss the elements of futility and how there's a duty of care, but when it's futile, then there's no duty of care. In the same way Ali Wada described Amr bil Ma'ruf in situations when you can actually enact the change. If there's no effect, then there's no duty of care necessarily. But my question is to the professor, if you don't mind. I wanted to ask a question on your presentation. When you discussed the principles of bioethics by Beauchamp and Childress. And I was, if I understand correctly, you said that justice is a key facet in that. What I was a bit more surprised to hear is that you divided them up into universal and relative principles. Could you please explain the principles by which you're able to actually divide them up?
No, these principles are universal, but the application may be, you see, there's a philosophy, there's a debate that's going on at the moment that these principles, which are autonomy, autonomy, beneficence, non-beneficence, justice, they are universal principles. But their application in different cultures, like you give an example of, for example, informed consent. Informed consent in the West is totally different to what you have in the East. That is called moral relativism. That means the principle is the same. Consent is necessary. But that consent, the way it is obtained, is different in different cultures. That is called right.
But I almost got the idea from your talk that you are condoning the concept of surrogate consent, which undermines the principle of autonomy.
This is what's happening. This is exactly why these dilemmas crop up. Because you see it all the time. If you work in India and Pakistan, surrogate consent is a standard thing.
Do you believe that that comes as a principle above autonomy?
Well, no, it is autonomy, but that is the way I use a terminology called surrogate consent. And this is a norm there. Everywhere in India and Pakistan, it's there. And like I give an example of Malaysia also.
But just because it's a norm, do you believe that that's an ethical principle that we should...
Well, it's not an ethical principle per se. It's a variation of that particular... See, that is why modifications keep on going all the time. I mean, these principles that Childress and Butcham gave, they came only in 1992. But ethics has been there for hundreds of years. They just modified. I'm sure there are many other principles. Within the framework of autonomy, you have trust and confidentiality, and you've got the concept of speaking truth, withdrawing the treatment, not giving the treatment, therapeutic nihilism, lots of things. I just briefly talked about the concept of moral relativism, which is applicable in certain situations. It does not compromise the status of the principles of ethics as such.
And surrogate consent is actually cultural impact.
Yes.
It's not, it's not right as you're saying. It's the cultural impact of the place that, they don't want to know. Some people say, we don't want to know what you've got.
Yeah.
Here we have to tell the patient.
No, but similarly, a patient does say to you that I don't want to know. They have actually rescinded their right to autonomy. But you can't assume that based on a cultural norm.
I think maybe the professor, because he was explicit, he's coming from an anthropological perspective.
Yeah.
So it's not being normative, it's being descriptive.
Yeah.
So when we say that the autonomy, in a sense, is a universal, basic aspiration, that's a normative position. So we're aiming for autonomy. So it could be descriptive to say that, from an anthropologist position, we're seeing autonomy manifest in this manner. But that, I think it seems from your comments that no, the aspiration would be autonomy in a sense which you're imagining.
Right, could we close this meeting very quickly with final remarks from our panel?
Well, I'd certainly like to thank you and the organizers, particularly of Al-Mahdi Institute, for giving us a great opportunity, for me as a student of ethics, to learn every time we go to meetings and learn new things. Great scholars, wonderful people here, meeting them and learning all the time. And of course, your effort and costumes, wonderful. Please keep going.
Sure, thank you very much. But any final sort of comments for the audience? Any take-home messages?
Well, be ethical and moral.
Again, thanks from the perspective of the Al-Mahdi Institute and from the opportunity to participate. I think there's a number of things which push us to say that, look, this ethical reasoning is complex, is contextual, is situational, which means a faqih can't give you a prescription for it. And also demands, and as I've said, that ijtihad is dynamic in Shia thought, and that's a source of pride for us. Okay, but this shows that there is movement and need to go forward, okay, from both sides of the fence, and only through interaction from religious scholarly audiences and medical audiences and economic audiences and the rest of it can that movement take place. And I think there are some fundamental questions which need to be addressed to allow this potential in Shia thought, built on this moral rationalism, to flourish.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to tell the audiences that just because you are Muslim or Shia, do not think that you are totally different from other people. We have a common ground with Jewish, Christians, the followers of other religions, and even non-religious people. And this common ground is our human identity. And this identity imposes us some normative limitations and constraints, which is the ethics. Therefore, we have to follow the ethics as much as we can, and in the framework of that general ethics, everyone has to follow his own system of law, his own Sharia, etc. Thank you very much.
I'm very grateful to IMI for organizing this meeting, and especially Ali for all the hard work he's put in. I can imagine what you have been through, having worked in the community before. My just, not really a message, but a plea is that we are in a very precarious situation. And especially I believe that Shia Muslim doctors are in a turmoil. And just to disagree with you slightly, in Christianity, homosexuality is almost becoming accepted. I don't see Islam ever accepting this, unless I'm wrong. And so things are very difficult, especially for young doctors, where in the medical curriculum, especially if you're doing a degree in extra year, when you do medical ethics or medical law or medical philosophy, you are taught Western version, Western concept of philosophy and morals and ethics. And there are, believe you, and I'm sure you will agree, that there are differences. And so our Shia young doctors really need guidance, and these sort of conferences are very good, where it gives them food for thought and guidance. And so thank you very much for the meeting.
I would like to thank Ali for inviting me. He has been a very good moderator. In many functions I have been a moderator and I have not been able to do the role you have done so nicely. As we have condemned the mullahs, but I can tell you, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. I heard a mullah learning about the cloning, comparing it with Kuluna Muhammad, Akhiruna Muhammad, Awwaluna Muhammad. So, that is something very important. We as human beings want every proof from Quran. We say, where is this in Quran? Where is this in Quran? Quran is not a book of science, S-C-I-E-N-C-E. It's a book of science. There are ayat in it, there are structures in it. And Quran has proven over the time, whatever it has predicted, it has been true. And that's my take-home message. Ilm, afala tadabbarun, afala taqilun. Think and think. Thank you very much.
It was really a very educational session. I'm sure everybody would agree. I'd encourage you all, now if we were to put this onto an audio or a video feed, I'd encourage you all to sort of, spread the message, get other people involved, and please pass on, if you like, the link to this presentation so that hopefully we should make this into a bigger and a more inclusive affair in the future. I think the need for it can't be at a more better time because, as you know, there has been a lot of turmoil recently. Unless we as a community come together for the common good, we'll not only be able to help our community, but we'll be able to help the wider cause of mankind, and I think that's our main duty. I'd like to thank the panel over here and Mr. Jaffrey, Dr. Vasi, everybody for taking time out from their families. And I know for a fact that a few people on the panel actually had very pressing domestic commitments, and they actually gave us the time for this meeting. I'd like to sort of end the meeting with a small announcement. In due course, we'll be having a meeting in Manchester, and hopefully we'll be able to sort of bring in more people into this discussion. In due course, we look to have meetings on different topics such as mental well-being, the sort of demand of physical well-being from our texts, the empowerment of women and how that in Islam actually makes our society, could potentially make our society a just and a strong society. So these are issues that we plan to sort of bring forward and have discussions on in the future. I'd like to end on a small note. I mean, as doctors, of course, we would like to sort of offer help, but again, we just treat. God heals. I'd like to end with a small prayer for those, a small prayer in contemplation, 5 very quiet, Ammayijibul Mustara, for people who are unwell, especially Dr. Valji's father who's in hospital, but also on the note that we pray for the families of those affected by violence recently, generally across mankind, and especially that young man in London. Refreshments are in what building is it, Sister Farana? Well, just follow the queue. I'm sure you'll find the refreshments are.